Hello, I'm Britt Udison, Executive and Artistic Director at the Loft Literary Center. Welcome to this live stream at Virtual Wordplay. I'm so glad you're here with us. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about what brought us here today. For the last year, the Loft staff has been working hard to put together an outdoor book festival that would have gathered 100 authors with 10,000 visitors in our neighborhood in downtown Minneapolis. As COVID-19 hit, we knew we had to think about everything we do differently, especially this festival. While we were disappointed that we wouldn't be able to gather in person, we became even more committed to supporting writers, celebrating new books, and finding new ways to assert the connective power of the written word. In a time of anxiety, we want to offer a powerful event for readers, writers, and booksellers. When we first approached our sponsors, their first question was, what is a virtual festival? And to be honest, we didn't know. Our founding partners, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune, agreed to make a leap of faith with the Loft. With courage, generosity, and vision, they have worked alongside us to figure out what this virtual festival might become. We are grateful to our sponsors and donors. Their generosity is incredible, but it is not enough. We believe it is essential, especially during a health and financial crisis, to offer programs that are free and accessible to all. But that has led to a significant revenue loss. A live event would have included ticket revenue, beer sales, exhibitor fees, and additional sponsorships. The Loft is not closed. We continue to offer classes, fellowships, conversations, support for readers and writers in addition to this festival. We are here to support the literary community, and we ask that you continue to support us. If you are able, please consider making a contribution to the Loft today. Thank you for being here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Elhigh, and welcome to the Loft's Wordplay. First, I would like to thank our presenting sponsors for Wordplay, St. Catherine University and the Star Tribune, and to mention that although all Wordplay events like this one are free, you can support Loft programming by clicking the support link below. And at this link, you can also purchase a copy of my book, The Lost Brothers, which we'll be discussing today. And so this discussion, I'll be joining with Donald Klein to talk about The Lost Brothers, a family's decades-long search published by the University of Minnesota Press. And this book tells two stories concurrently. The first is, of course, the disappearance of the three Klein brothers, Kenneth Jr., who was 8 years old, David, 6, and Danny, 4, after they left their home on November 10th, 1951, to play at a nearby park in their North Minneapolis neighborhood, along with the police search for them, which was called off after only 5 days. And the second thread to the story is about the continuing search for these brothers by their parents, Betty and Kenneth Klein, that lasted for the rest of their lives. The Klein family's life after this catastrophe and follow-up investigations. One of those follow-up investigations was launched in the 1990s by Minneapolis Park Police Sergeant Jim Schultz, and another began in the present decade by Wright County, Minnesota Sheriff's Deputies Jessica Miller and Lance Sauls, who have been working on their own time. And I should also mention that, in addition, the story that I tell in The Lost Brothers is retold in a new medium and with a different approach in Long Lost, a serialized historical investigative podcast produced by Twin Cities PBS. Long Lost is available through any of the services you may use to download podcasts. So now it's time for me to introduce Donald Klein, who is our guest now. Donald is the youngest of the siblings of Kenneth Jr., David, and Danny. Donald was born 9 years after his brother's disappearance. And I want to thank you, Donald, for joining us here. It's great to have you on this.
I'm glad to be here.
I thought we would start our discussion with a question which may seem kind of elementary, basic, but it's important nonetheless. And it's, How has your brother's disappearance affected your family over all these decades since 1951?
It's affected us in every aspect, I think, of our lives, whether it's getting together for a birthday or for holidays, uh, even vacations. We didn't take a lot of vacations with my parents because they were afraid to spend money on vacations in case they had to follow a lead. So, and they didn't have anybody that would do that. The people in law enforcement, of course, weren't doing that part of it for them. So whatever had to be funded was funded out of the family money.
Mm-hmm. And what about the way that it affected how you grew up and how you interacted with your brothers and your parents?
Well, you have a tendency I grew up right in the midst of it. Of course, it was always there ever since I can remember. I don't remember a time when suddenly it came on me like Gordy. With Gordy, of course, it's a little different. But with me, I grew up in it. It was a constant. But it created divisions in our family. Uh, it's made it very difficult for my parents, I think, in many ways, because they had that constantly in the back of their minds. Anytime any of us did anything or went anywhere out of their sight, not that they stopped us or kept us captive or like birds in a cage, but that had to have been very difficult for them to allow us to go down to the river after, like me, I grew up out here a mile away from the river. We used to go down there and go fishing. And we did that. I think I started doing that when I was probably 8 or 9 with my older brothers. So you can imagine what my parents had to have gone through just thinking about that. But yet, in order for us to have some semblance of a normal childhood, they had to allow us to do it.
Mm-hmm. So you're speaking to us right now from your home in Monticello, Minnesota, which was your parents' home earlier. And before that, they and your family lived a little outside of town, correct, in a farmhouse, which was ironically very close to the Mississippi River, which is where in Minneapolis, the police postulated that your 3 missing brothers went to and drowned in. So do you think the presence of the river nearby where you were growing up was a, kind of a burdensome presence? Did you think about it much? Did your parents think about it?
I didn't think about it, Jack. I mean, as a kid, I went down there, and I've never been a great swimmer. I can dive very well, but I used to go out in the river and get out over my head and get out in the current and go down, and that was just part of the play, But I'm sure if my mom and dad had known that, they'd have been horrified.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's because they never believed that the brothers or their sons drowned in the river. It was because they did come to the conclusion that they were abducted.
Right. You mentioned a few minutes ago your brother Gordy. Gordy's situation was a lot different from yours because you were born after your brothers disappeared. Gordy was a 9-year-old when it happened, and has felt, as the book talks about, has felt responsible at times or guilty at times. How do you think his experience was different from yours as the older brother versus the youngest?
Well, of course, like you say, he had that guilt, and that guilt, I doubt it ever has diminished or gone away. It doesn't matter how many times you're told that it's not your fault, but when you take care of younger siblings and you're told that that's your responsibility, that stays with you. And they were his responsibility when they went to the park and they went places to play because he was the oldest. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that it's been a very hard life for him. I don't know how you could erase that feeling.
Much of the book and the podcast is about your parents' efforts to find their sons. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on why they devoted themselves for so long to searching for your brothers. And do you think they ever reached some kind of resolution about it? Some kind of place of peace?
The reason why they spent so much time on it is they never believed that they were dead. They always felt that they were alive, and they did feel that they had been abducted, but not to be murdered, but to be adopted. And that was their hope, of course, and that would, I suppose, would be a natural hope for any parent that's lost children, is to hope for the best, and that's the best that you can hope for. Other than them having them actually walk in the door, that's about as good as you can get. But I think they came to peace with it eventually because of their Christian beliefs. My mom mentioned that, after my dad died, she said, well, now your father knows. And she said, when I go, I'll know. And if nothing else, it'd be the same for you kids. If you don't know in this world, you'll know in the next. And that was her faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you also believe that your brothers were abducted and may still be alive? Do you share your parents' belief in that? And has that evolved over the years for you?
I go back and forth between being abducted and killed as children, because there's so much of that. Jacob Wetterling is a prime example, but that happens all the time. That's a continuous thing here in this country and in the world. But I guess I was brought up hoping and believing that they were alive, and ultimately, in my heart, that's my hope of hopes, is that they're still alive, or at least died of natural causes, that they weren't murdered as children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What would be your reaction or response if you were somehow to find out that they were murdered as children?
Well, at least we'd know something. We'd know more than we do now. As tragic as it is to find something like that out, it's still some closure. I mean, obviously, we're never going to get the person that did it. And after this many years, I think my mom put it best when she said that she wasn't out for revenge, that would be taken care of by a higher power. And we feel the same way. I mean, even if they were alive, at least we'd know what happened to our brothers. We could put a headstone up for them. That would be a big thing for all of us if we could do that without having the case shut down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we don't want them forgotten.
Yeah. Before we started talking live about this, I promised you, Donald, that I wouldn't throw you any unexpected questions, but I'm about to do that right now because one just occurred to me. And I'm interested in hearing what Gordy and your parents told you about your brothers, and how you imagine them, how you think of them.
Well, I've got a picture of them I inherited from my mom. It's of them when they were young, just before they were, I suppose 2 years or 3 years before they were taken. Danny is still baby, so it's an early picture, but I still imagine them as being young. I don't think of them as adults, which is kind of strange, but to me, they've always been young because that's the way they were when I was introduced to all this, or as I went through this growing up. Mm-hmm. I realize logically that they're adults and that they would look more like Gordy. Mm-hmm. That's what I think. That's in my imagination. Mm-hmm. But yeah,
they'd all be in their 70s now.
Yes, sir. Yes, they would. And that's kind of hard to imagine.
What about their personalities?
It seems like they all got along good. That's what Gordy always talked about, how they got along so well. Kenneth was kind of the next leader. Gordy was, of course, the oldest, so he was the boss in charge, but Kenneth would have been the next natural one. And he sounds like he was very charismatic, and he knew how to get his way with things. Well, like my mom said, he begged and begged that they could go to the park until finally she relented and let him go. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would think of him as a leader, and then Davy, I really don't know when it comes to Davy. I just imagine him as being that little kid following along after Kenneth and Gordon. Mm-hmm. And then Danny, of course, he was so young. I guess he would be nothing but a tag along, to put it, in perspective. He really didn't have a voice in what was going on. He just followed. he was glad to be there and be a participant in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would think maybe in life he probably retained that more of a follower than a leader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to this day, when I interviewed for the book and the podcast, your uncle and others who knew the boys, they referred to Danny as the baby.
Yeah.
He was only 4 when all this happened.
Yep.
So a large part of the book is also about the efforts of Jessica Miller and Lance Sauls to gather together all the information that had been scattered about your brother's case and to put it in one place and to move it forward by following some clues and looking up some more things and putting things together, and then also developing a list of suspects because they concluded that the boys likely had been abducted. How did you feel when you learned that 2 new investigators were taking a fresh look?
I was excited, especially I was a little shocked that it was Wright County, but when I met them, I was just immediately impressed with both of them. Lance is no small man. He's a big guy.
Yeah.
In the worst of times, I wouldn't give him no sass. But Jessica, she's almost an opposite of him. She's a very personable person, very likable, and she got along with my mom so well. And to me that was very important, that my mother was well respected through it all. Not interrogated or treated like just an information source. Jessica would sit and listen to Mom, and she was careful how she asked questions. I could tell that she cared about my mother, and that was very important.
And I should mention here that the reason why 2 Wright County Sheriff's deputies got involved was that Wright County is where Monticello is located, and Jessica met your mother when she was gathering blood. She was, the way I understand it, she needed to draw some blood from your mother for inclusion in a missing persons database because that had never been done for your brothers, and got to know Betty and really connected with her. And that's when Jessica and Lance decided on their own time to look into all of this.
And they've done an excellent job. If they'd have been there when this took place, it'd have been solved, I'm sure, because they are very professional. I mean, it's not just that they donated their time to this, but I actually have faith in their abilities as law enforcement officers. I think their training is excellent, and I do think that we've come a long way with training officers. Mm-hmm. Just watching the way that they work together.
Mm-hmm. So they not only weren't there when this happened, as you said, but they weren't born yet when this happened. And the investigation that did take place back in 1951 was a Minneapolis Police Department investigation that lasted only 5 days before the police closed it. And the police, as we mentioned earlier, reached a conclusion that the 3 boys had wandered down to the Mississippi River and playing by the banks of the river had drowned. Even though this was in November, there was already ice on the river. And the police department's reasons for thinking this way was that they had gotten a tracking dog involved. How good this dog was or how good the dog's trainer was isn't known today, but the dog did follow a track that wound around for about 6 or 7 miles through the neighborhood and eventually ended at the river's edge. And also 2 of the caps, since it was winter, they were wearing wool caps that your brothers were found on top of the ice in the river, some ways downstream from where the dog had ended its track. So that's what led police to make that conclusion, even though there was no evidence that the boys had actually been to the river. and this is the conclusion that so dissatisfied your parents. Did your parents ever discuss what it was like for them to receive this news from the police? That's what the police think happened, and for the police to end their searching.
It was devastating for my parents. Like everyone else, like all of us out here, as citizens, we think that we have entitlements to certain things, and help from law enforcement when we need it is, of course, one of the big ones. And for them to do what they did was horrible, and we've been trying to get what information they'd collected all these years, and we've never been able to even get the files that they have. If they closed it, which they did after 5 days, why didn't they ever give the files to my parents then when they asked for them, or any one of the number of years since then, or the FBI for that matter, or the BCA? They've all stonewalled us on these things. Mm-hmm. When Humphrey investigated it, the FBI told them they had no files on it, yet they did.
Yes, they did.
They went out of their way.
Yeah. Hubert Humphrey was senator, U.S. senator from Minnesota, when this inquiry from your parents came to him, and he contacted J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI at the time, asking what they had. Hoover responded that there were no records, but that wasn't true. The FBI did have records. I was able to access some of them through a Freedom of Information Act request. And also, the FBI had some of the Minneapolis Police Department records, which the police didn't have anymore, or do have, but can't find. And so I can very much understand why your parents and your family has felt betrayed in this case by the original law enforcement investigators, who seem to rush through it and come to conclusions that neatly tied things up, but don't reflect even what evidence was available back then.
Yeah, it doesn't show a reality that 3 bodies, one of them should have showed up in the river, and they did extensive searches of the river. That's another thing that they didn't like to talk about. It's like my dad used to say when he would ask them, "Where's the bodies?" Well, then they would want to change the subject. They just wanted to believe that they were dead in the river. That was all they wanted. And they wanted my parents, most of all, to believe that, and the public.
Mm-hmm. So, Donald, Jessica Miller and Lance Sauls did turn up some new information and developed a list of suspects. I'm not going to get into here who those suspects are, because I don't want to provide spoilers for anyone who would read the book or listen to the podcast later on. But what do you hope from any new evidence that's brought up? What, from you and your family's perspective, would be a good place for all this to end?
I would like to hope that they were abducted, not to be molested or to have horrible things done to them, but to be adopted out to families that truly wanted children so bad that they were willing to take such drastic measures, that they were treated very well, got good educations, moved on, had wonderful lives, children, and never had any of the shadow of this over them. Because I hope they never remembered that they were abducted and that they had good lives. Mm-hmm. That would be a great closure for all of us.
And that's not implausible, because in the 1950s, there were some below the radar adoption schemes going on in the United States, in which children were taken from their parents or abducted in some cases, and then adopted out to other families. So it did happen, and it is possible that is what happened to your brothers. What do you want readers of my book or listeners of the podcast to know about your brothers and your family's search for them? What should they know about all this?
Well, we're not the kind of people that give up on our own, and we don't give up on others either. It's, I guess it's instilled in us boys from our parents, and watching them go look for our brothers. They spared no expense, and they did what they thought they had to do. I mean, if it meant dropping everything and traveling to take care of it, they did it. So, and that's kind of the way we are when it comes to taking care of our own or those we care about.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the book or the podcast has changed anything? Has it made a difference for you?
It has for me. It stirs up a lot of things, a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings, and not all of them are positive. It's a constant ordeal. The other night, I went to bed at midnight. I was up at 2, and I stayed up the rest of the day, partially because I had to go to work. But it was part of this, part of this ongoing search for the brothers. It's not uncommon for me, and Gordy's even worse. He doesn't have good nights because, like he says, I have dreams, and I don't know what his dreams are. I don't want to pry because that's not my place. That's personal for him. And his relationship with the brothers was personal compared to mine. Mine's through the family, but his was direct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you can see how it's afflicted him, and it's afflicted me. So, but some of it's good. I met Jessica Miller and Sells. You wrote a book, and it's a good book. I've enjoyed reading it. A matter of fact, there's a few things in there I wasn't aware of, and I'm glad I got to know them. I mean, because there's so much more evidence that's been brought together. Finally, it's been brought together in one place. And it is available for law enforcement. It is available to the BCA, the FBI, missing children. All these groups now can finally get the information. And it's a mass, and it's huge. It's a huge amount of information.
Mm-hmm.
So good things have come.
Another important recent development has been that Jessica Miller and Lance Sells have made sure that information about your brothers has been entered into these national registries of missing children or missing people. And so if in the future someone comes forward or it remains are found or anything like that, that can be checked against the information in these databases to see if there is a match.
Absolutely. I think that's so important that that's available in this day and age. I mean, child abductions have taken place forever. I mean, it's an unfortunate thing, but there's never been a lack of it happening in the world or in the United States. It's not just our family. We're not the Lone Rangers or the only victims. There's so many people out there, and there's so many you don't hear about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you remember, Donald, the earliest moment when you became aware that you had missing brothers?
I grew up with it, but when our stepbrother, or not stepbrother, but foster brother was taken, that did something to me where it all came together. And I think that's really my greatest connection to Gordy, because I lost somebody kind of the way he did. They were there and then they were gone.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little more about that? People may not be familiar with what you're talking about, losing that foster brother.
Well, my mom took care of a foster child when I was a young man, about 4.5 years old. I suppose I was 4 when he came into the family, and he was still in diapers. But we took care of him, and he was introduced to me as my brother, and it was my job to take care of him, as the other brothers were at school. Mm-hmm. And one day, a car pulled into the driveway while my brother and I were in the driveway playing by the doorway where the rock gardens were, right there along the driveway. But anyway, pulled in, and 2 women were in it. And I heard one of the women say, "That's him." And the other one said, "Well, which one?" And she said, "Well, I'm not sure, but I think it's a blonde." And Pat was blonde. I, of course, had my red hair, so quite a striking difference between. And the one jumped out of the passenger seat and ran up and grabbed Pat, my brother Pat, and took him back to the car and said to the driver, "Hurry up, let's get out of here before that," well, unflattering name for my mother. And they sped off. I was standing there screaming for my mom because she was the only one home. Dad was at work, of course. And by the time she got out, they were already partway down the driveway with Pat. and they took Pat, and he went to a woman that should never have had a child. A judge had forbid her from having foster children. He was even skeptical about her having her own children. And within 18 months, she had tortured him to death.
Mm-hmm. So your parents lost children in two separate episodes, years ago.
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did your parents ever talk about the experience of losing children?
You know, my mom never said much about Pat, but when she did talk about Pat, she talked to me because, of course, I was there and I spent time with him. I was the one that was home and able to do it. We went and played together. We were brothers. But I didn't, unbeknownst to me, she had collected everything and anything she found about him in the newspapers, including the trial of the woman who got him and killed him. I never knew that till after she passed away. I found it in her things. I suppose she was hesitant to give it to me because she wasn't for sure how I had taken. Mm-hmm. But mm-hmm. Just like the news clippings she saved from the other three boys.
Mm-hmm. You, I think you kind of occupy the role in your family now as family historian because you have a lot of this stuff that your parents accumulated. Do you look through it? What else has it told you?
Oh, through the years, you know, when we moved from the farm, of course, we found a box of stuff that had been secreted up in an attic. And that was the stuff that Michael Sadovich got. He was the one we hired, a private investigator we hired to look into parts of this. And of course, we lost that. That was part of the stuff that was here in this house after they moved to town. That was part of the box that was here, present, that disappeared, that Michael Sadovich had returned to us. Mm-hmm. But it was funny. There was stuff like that, you know, that they saved things and they put it away. In fact, I still have hopes of finding stuff because they put it away in places where they knew it would be safe, but they'd forget where they put it. Mm-hmm. So it's amazing. I've found a few odds and ends, and I did take some stuff or give some stuff over to Jessica Miller here about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. I'm in an envelope of stuff I found. So who knows? You know, who knows what's still here? I probably won't know until I actually move out of this house myself, so I gather everything up. Mm-hmm. But I poke around and look and go through stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe this would be a good place for us to break and take questions that anyone in the viewing audience has.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Abby from the Loft Literary Center, and I'll be fielding audience questions here. Thank you so much to Jack, and thank you, Donald, for sharing this story with us. We're really grateful to have you both here. And just a quick reminder, you can buy Jack's book, The Lost Brothers, to read more about the case and the Klein family at the link below. All right, so our first question from the audience is from Savannah. Donald, you mentioned how the existing information was scattered about and how this book helped finally bring it all together. Jack, could you talk a little bit about your process of finding all of this and piecing it together and how you got started down the path of investigating this tragedy?
Working on this story go back a long time, more than 20 years actually. I learned about the missing brothers back in 1997 when I happened to open this Sunday newspaper and saw in the classified ad section an ad that said, paraphrasing here, but said something like, seeking information on the three lost Klein brothers, Kenneth, David, and Danny. Please contact with any information. And then it listed a phone number in Wright County. And I'd never heard of this, but I called the number to find out more of what it's about. I'm terminally nosy and curious, and reached Betty Klein on the phone. And she briefly explained to me about her son's disappearance, and then invited me to come to their house to talk about it and learn more about it. And I had told her that I was interested in writing about it. I did end up writing a story about it in 1998 for Minnesota Monthly magazine, and kept in touch with Betty and Kenneth a little bit after that, but then got back into the story much more actively after Jessica Miller, the Wright County Sheriff's Deputy, contacted me, I think it was in 2013, telling me about their investigation. And so the sources that I used to write the book were a lot of interviews, interviewing people like Donald, other members of his family, other people involved in the case. Then, of course, the newspaper clip, this disappearance was very heavily covered in the press in the Twin Cities back in 1951. So using those resources. And then Jessica and Lance had gathered up an enormous amount of material, which they allowed me to use. And then the materials like the FBI file that I requested on my own and some other things like that, all were used to put the story together. And it's still a developing story. Things are still happening, and there will be more to write about in the future, I'm certain.
Great, thank you. This might be a question for both of you from Jean. Do you know why the Minneapolis Police Department gave up so quickly? Did they ever have an explanation for that?
Donald, do you want to give that a try?
I will give you an answer from what I heard my parents say. And that was because the department's mindset was stuck on the drowning. It was fast, it was easy, and it put an end to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the answer I would give is much like that. And I would only add that the early 1950s were different times than now in terms of law enforcement and how people perceived an occurrence of missing children. I mean, now, if this were to happen, abduction would be on people's minds and the investigators' minds right away, I think. Mm-hmm. Abduction, I don't know if it was less common in 1951 than it is now, but it was certainly less thought of. And so the two possibilities that came to the minds of the police back then were running away, the boys ran away, or some accidental mishap befell them. And they were really blind to other possibilities. I don't think their intentions were evil or bad. I think they were just limited in their thinking.
Thank you. Great. This is a question from Seth. Jack, you handled the subject so thoroughly. Is true crime your new beat, or are you on to new projects?
Well, I did enjoy writing about this a great deal. I've been a reader of true crime myself for a long time, but I think one thing that working on this project taught me about true crime is that the story doesn't have to be entirely about the crime or even the victim, that there are other stories that are wrapped up in this, like in this case, the family's stories and the stories of the investigators. And I would like to do more stories like that. I'm currently working on another book which is not related to crime. It's more of a medical nonfiction story like I've done in the past with my books, The Lobotomist and the Nazi and the Psychiatrist. But I would certainly love to return to crime and justice as a topic. And I do have a story in mind that looks very promising.
Thank you. This is another question for Jack. Are there any true crime books, podcasts, or shows that inspired you in writing this book? And what did you try to keep in mind when writing about something so challenging and difficult?
Inspired me, yes. And there's also another thing that I veered away from intentionally. Inspiring me, although I don't think it influenced the writing of this book very much, is a book that some of you out there may know called The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule. And I think Ann Rule was a prolific true crime writer, but I think this was by far the best of her books. It's about the serial killer Ted Bundy. And it's the best of her books because it's about her friendship with Ted Bundy. She knew Ted before before it was known that he had gone on these killing sprees. And she had a connection, and she felt betrayed as a friend of his. And so there is that running through the book. And I think what was inspiring to me was combining the personal story with the crime story. And it made both richer. A book that I wanted to veer away from and not write like was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which in important ways it has come out, was fictionalized. Capote was not much of a note taker and reconstructed scenes and dialogue afterward. I wanted my book to be really based on factual material. There are a number of podcasts too that I like, but too many of them.
Great. Donald, this is a question for you if you're comfortable. I'm sure that you've been telling this story your whole life, and we're wondering how the experience might have been different telling this story to Jack, who's working on a book and a podcast, as opposed to other people investigating or friends, family.
Well, with Jack, it's much more in depth, of course, because I knew he was writing or working on a book, and he has ways of asking questions which are unobtrusive, but they're to the point, which, most people come up and they just want to hear the story, but they don't want to hear the intricate details. They just want you to gloss it over, wrap it up in 1 to 2 minutes, and, everybody keeps moving. But yeah, no, Jack, it was a lot different, very much different. It was nice. I actually enjoy being interviewed by Jack. Still enjoy talking to Jack, but yeah, more in depth, more about feelings, more about the little facts and stuff like that, that you just don't discuss with somebody that just flies through.
Great. Yeah, that's definitely. Oh, go ahead, Jack.
Well, in here, I'd like to give a shout out to Katie O'Rourke, who may be watching now, but she was the producer of the Twin Cities PBS podcast, Long Lost. And in that version, in that approach to the storytelling, she played a big role in shaping, not only the questions that we asked in our interviews, but the structure of the story and what we focused on too.
Great. That actually leads perfectly into the next question from Britt, which is for Jack. How does storytelling differ in a podcast versus in a book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought a lot about this because if we had taken the book, which is its own thing, and tried to directly translate that into a podcast, I don't think it would have worked very well. I've sometimes said that a book is a direct conduit into your reader's mind, whereas a podcast is more of a whisper in the ear. A podcast, I think, is most effective when it's personal, which is why you see so many podcasts that are personal. If not people directly telling their stories, hosts who are becoming characters in the story and filtering the story that way. So Katie and I knew that we needed to make it more personal in the podcast. I narrate a good part of it in the podcast, and that we had these great audio resources to use that are difficult to translate into print, like historical audio. KSTP News was on the scene back in 1951. There are TV reporters covering this, and we had that audio to use. All the interviews that we did, which in Donald and others expresses their emotion in a way that would be difficult to get into print. And it turned out to be a different way of telling the story. As I said, more personal and more direct in a way. The book is its own thing. It's a journalistic, long form type of telling of the story. And then the podcast is different. That's really all I can say.
Great. I think that's all we have time for. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Jack, to close us out. But please check out Jack's book, The Lost Brothers. Again, you can buy it at the link below. Thanks again, Donald and Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And I just want to mention quickly 2 upcoming events that I'm doing for the Loft. One is a virtual workshop called the Idea Machine. That'll be on May 16th. It'll be a virtual but live like this, about how to develop, appraise, and store ideas for work you may be doing in nonfiction, fiction, or poetry, or other writing genres. And then the second one will be the last week of May, and it'll be a creative nonfiction virtual workshop in association with Wordplay on writing about family, tragedy, and crime. And you can find more information about both of those through the Loft on their website. This has been one of many events as part of the Loft's Wordplay. Our thanks again to presenting sponsors St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. A reminder again, though all Wordplay events are free, you can support Loft programming like this by clicking the support link below. And again, you can purchase a copy of The Lost Brothers there too. Thanks very much, Donald, for being here with us. It made it happen. And thanks to all of you for watching today.
Thank you, Jack, for all you've done. The whole family appreciates it, believe me.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.